My name is Daryl Maxwell. I'm an adult librarian with Los Angeles Public Library at the West Valley Regional Branch. I'm also a Reader's Advisory Advocate. I also provide blog content for the LAPL blog in the form of author interviews and book reviews.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Morton. I had the great pleasure of inaugurating this particular line, the Haunted Library of Horror Classics, when I was the HWA's president. I did step down from that position in 2015. I am a screenwriter, an author of over 150 short stories, a 6-time winner of the Bram Stoker Award, and a Halloween expert.
And an editor.
And an editor.
Of anthologies.
True.
Hello, I'm Eric J. Guignard. I'm an author, editor, and anthologist as well. I enjoy the short form. I enjoy contemporary, modern works. I enjoy historic works. I enjoy blended works. Anything that's imaginative and dark tones. It's something it's right up my alley. I run a small publisher called Dark Moon Books, and I'm across social media and always happy to continue these conversations with anybody else who shares the same interests.
I'm Les Klinger, and Lisa said HWA, that's the Horror Writers Association, which is an international nonprofit organization educating the public and boosting the genre of dark fantasy, urban and mythological horror, sort of across the genre of supernatural, etc. I am an editor / anthologist and joined the HWA back when I did my first book in this field, which was the annotated Dracula, and have been deeply involved ever since, and now the treasurer of this. And was very excited when Lisa came to the board of trustees of HWA with this idea and suggested very happily that my friends at the Poison Pen Press, which was at that time a standalone, a small press affiliated with the Poison Pen bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, might well be interested in doing something other than just mysteries, which is all they had done previously. And they were very excited about the idea of publishing a line of horror classics. Fortunately for us, at almost the same time, Poison Pen Press was acquired by Sourcebooks, the largest independent publisher in the United States, and has now become an imprint of Sourcebooks. And so we're thrilled to be working with the Sourcebooks people, which is a very substantial distribution network. So Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of what was your idea? What was the concept?
Yeah, this was kind of mine right from when I first took office as HWA's president. And I realized I actually switched my dates in my introduction. I stepped in 2014 and stepped out in 2019. And one of the things I really wanted to investigate when I stepped in as president was the notion of expanding our core mission statement, which is to make the public more aware of horror literature and its fine history. And we, at some point, started to talk about maybe, I think John Palisano and I, the current president, even at some point, had been talking about, wouldn't it be great if we could do a series of horror classics that would come out under HWA's imprint. And I loved the idea of including teaching guides in these books. By day, I am a used bookseller. I deal all day long with teachers who come in and say, I wish that such and such had a teaching guide. I could really use that in my classroom. And so when we signed with a new agent, Alex Shane at Writer's House, he and I started talking about trying to shop this idea. And we hit actually only one other publisher before we went to Poison Pen. And we really kind of firmed up the whole proposal in between that. And I was thrilled when both Les and Eric agreed to be a part of this and take it on as the series editors. And at that point, we had our deal in place. We had the editors in place. We had the first few titles chosen, and I was very happy to step aside and let these two incredibly talented men take over.
So I think this one of the key elements of the series is partnership with libraries. And this is probably a good time to say a word about the Horror Writers Association commitment to libraries. It's of long standing. And this year we are presenting with ARRT our 4th annual HWA Librarians Day, which is a free virtual continuing education event that will feature authors, reviewers, publishers, and librarians from all over the country. Whether you're just a fan of horror or you can't stand it because it scares the heck out of you, we think that library workers everywhere should learn about horror as a genre and matching the books with readers. Daryl, this is something I know that's been important to you, emphasizing genre fiction generally in your library programs.
Yeah, and I latched onto something that you said about Poison Pen, the bookstore, and then their imprint, and how they're moving into a different genre with this series. But this is one of the things, and it's a subject that keeps coming up, and I'd love to know what you guys think about it, because when we mention a genre, when we mention mysteries, when you mention horror, they sound like very divided things, when in reality, with so many books, and especially classic books, they cross genres, or they can easily fall into any of a number of things. I mean, my perfect example of this is Frankenstein, which, because of its adaptations over history and just the tone of the book, it seems like it's clearly horror. And yet the questions that Shelley's asking, I mean, it's also the first speculative fiction novel, or one of the first, asking really important questions about the science and technology of the time. And so I was curious what you guys think, because there are so many people who think of genres as these silos, but there's so much bleed over.
I'm glad you asked that question. It sounds like Passover. So Lisa and I have been giving that some thought, because we just did an anthology that came out in August, I guess, called Weird Women, which was a collection of supernatural / horror fiction, if you will, written by women in the 19th century. And one of the things that you'll find when you buy yourself a copy of this anthology, which can be found at your local bookstore, is that you'll recognize, or the library, is that you'll recognize some of the names. I mean, it's my sense that in the 19th century, many writers, maybe all writers, had no fixation on genre. They didn't put labels on themselves. So you have a Louisa May Alcott who wrote a wonderful book like Little Women, and then turned around and wrote thrillers and horror stories. We'll talk in a few minutes about Arthur Conan Doyle, and so on. And these writers were writing, I mean, Harriet Spofford. We have a story by Harriet Spofford in this collection, which is a almost Lovecraftian story. And I also included a story by Harriet Spofford in my collection of called In the Shadow of Agatha Christie, which was about early mystery fiction, because she wrote a couple of mysteries also. She didn't think of herself as, oh, I'm a horror writer, oh, I'm a mystery writer. She thought of herself as a writer. And so she wrote things that interested her, and they weren't typically labeled. I think Eric, you want to talk a little bit about the Doyle book? Well, we should mention some of the titles that we have in our series and sort of how they got there. I should start by saying that you won't see Frankenstein or Dracula in this series for the simple reason that there are already plentiful, easily accessible editions of those books. That's not quite our aim. But Eric, do you want to talk about sort of the titles that we picked and why?
Sure. I would say most of the titles that we selected, the average horror reader, even somebody who considers themselves well-versed in the genre, would probably have no idea most of these books are about. We selected books that not only do we look at them and say, you know, these were treasures of literature, not only in their day, but they should still be found valuable for different aspects. These are books that have been the inspiration of authors over generations. So the authors that we look at today and we say, you know, Ray Bradbury inspired me and Richard Matheson inspired me. If you were to ask Bradbury and Matheson who their inspirations were, then they're going to go back and they're going to say, you know, there are authors like William Hope Hodgson and William Beckford and Richard Marsh, and those are the authors that inspired them. So we're keeping the cycle going that these books still have meaning today. The first title that was released, it goes a little bit against what Les and I mentioned because it's The Phantom of the Opera, and that's a book that is widely recognizable. A couple of reasons for starting off with that is that The Phantom of the Opera is a more recognizable title from its musical adaptations and the movie adaptations, rather than the actual novel, which really is completely different from what you've seen on screen. It just goes in a lot different, darker directions. Additionally, personally, I looked at The Phantom of the Opera as well as kind of setting the tone that we want to promote these books that readers aren't familiar with, but at the same time, The Phantom of the Opera kind of brings it down a notch so that it doesn't seem too ivory tower for the average reader.
Right.
It gives.
Yeah, these are not scholarly.
Yeah.
We're not trying to pick out, you know. Yeah.
It sets the tone. It lets people look at it and say, oh yeah, you know, I'm familiar with The Phantom of the Opera, and because you have a certain familiarity with this first title, I think individuals are more open to exploring these other titles that they may not have heard of before, and they may have shied away from, that if they think, you know, if this may be in the same vein as The Phantom of the Opera, I'm willing to give it a little bit more of a chance. So that's kind of some of the philosophy that Les and Lisa and Robert at Poison Pen and a couple of others talked through. And we've gone through, I don't know, hundreds of different titles that we've thought about the different benefits, how people would like them, how we can diversify the line into looking at different styles of writing, you know, all at the same time trying to find different voices while still kind of promoting the ideals of really also what the Horror Writers Association is about. In the Horror Writers Association, we are promoting horror. We're promoting dark literature. We're not promoting just splatterpunk and violence, but we're promoting these literary ideals of individuals that are discussing the world as they see it through a very emotionally resonant tones. So that was a lot of a backstory. Phantom of the Opera, as I mentioned, was the first volume. We move on to The Beetle by Richard Marsh. And I think this ties in very well to what Daryl was earlier mentioning. As far as these books, they don't really have a hard delineation of purely horror. The Beetle was a mystery. The Beetle was marketed as a mystery book. And it certainly has a lot of horror, and it has very bizarre supernatural elements. But it's also, it's by a very famous mystery author. So all of these books, they do cross back and forth. After that, we have Vathek, and then The House of the Borderland for Cthulhu and the weird enthusiasts. Beginning of next year, we have Of One Blood by Pauline Hopkins, one of the first true horror and supernatural books by a woman of African-American color. And then Arthur Conan Doyle, a collection of stories, one of Les's babies. Personally, I had never read any of Conan Doyle outside of the Sherlock Holmes canon. So this has become my personal favorite volume out of the series. I love these stories. They're still thrilling today.
And they're a perfect example of what I was saying before about a writer who did not view himself as a mystery writer. He was a writer of adventure, romance, domestic tales, and horror. He loved writing these sort of semi-supernatural. By the way, most people don't know that his short story was the basis for the film The Mummy. Of course, people also remember The Lost World. They all know the Lost World films and the Jurassic Park films. Those are based loosely on Conan Doyle's book called The Lost World and sequels. But this was a joy. And so I mentioned in particular the headline of that book, it's called The Parasite and Other Tales of Terror. So The Parasite is another sort of vampire story. Just as The Beetle is sort of vaguely vampiric, this one is about a psychic vampire. That is to say, a vampire who draws energy from their victims rather than blood. And it's a terrific story. And these were very, very popular in their day, but are largely not remembered anymore. So The Beetle, for example, came out almost simultaneously with Bram Stoker's Dracula and outsold it, readily outsold it. But he didn't get a movie. He had no movie deals. So,
Or plays.
or plays. So it did, that's exactly right. Good point, Daryl. So it didn't get the attention that Dracula did. It didn't have the legs that Dracula did. And we have more, Eric. Don't forget, we have, coming up, we have an all-time classic that I just don't think gets near enough attention, and that is M.R. James's Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. This man is generally regarded as, and Lisa is our expert on this subject, James is really the granddaddy of ghost story writers, or probably the greatest writer of ghost stories ever. This is a splendid collection. And then who knows what else?
Is that an opening for?
Well, sure, yeah. Well, actually, we do have one title we just started working on, which
Yeah,
I just
we have
happened
a
to
good
mention.
line, and don't forget we have The King in Yellow.
Oh, yes, I forgot about that.
Yeah, by Robert W. Chambers. The Castle of Otranto, considered one of the grandfather of novels of the Gothic era, the Gothic tone of book. We also have The Mummy by Jane Webb, and Phantasmorgiana. If I pronounce that right, I may not. Lisa may be able to correct me on my pronunciation.
Phantasmagoriana. You were very close.
All right. Yeah, I gave it the college effort.
And Lisa can talk more about that book, but that book is essential because it's the book that launched Frankenstein. It's the book, everybody knows the story about how Mary Shelley and the crowd were reading ghost stories to each other. This is the book that they were reading to each other at the time. It's got great stuff in it.
And astonishingly has been printed very few times throughout history. It's very hard to find. So I'm really happy about making that one available to a wide readership again.
So circling back to the library aspects of this, I think we ought to talk a little bit about sort of how these books are structured. And it's a division of labor. I do the easy part, which is drop in a few footnotes here and there. Eric does the hard work of formatting. But we also have, in addition to formatting, some really essential things that we think from a library standpoint, which is, first, there's a short introduction by a well-known figure in the field. That's supposed to be eye-catching for the reader to see that this one's got an introduction by Ramsey Campbell or Nancy Holder or Joe Lansdale and the like. But more importantly, Eric has crafted a meaty little section called About the Author, which is a good sort of mini biography of the author. We have Further Reading, which is really very well done by Eric, I must say.
Those are excellent.
Yeah, really a good list of, if you like this book, you might want to read these. And also, if you want to learn more about this book, here's some secondary sources that you might look at as well. But primarily similar books, some of them inspired by these very books, some of them copying, some of them just similar. And then finally, as I think someone mentioned earlier, and that's discussion group questions. I mean, we really see these books as aimed at libraries and the educational market. They are moderately priced trade paperback volumes that we hope will develop a large audience, and many of that audience, we hope, will be new to the horror genre, or at least eager to learn more about the horror genre. And so we have fascinating discussion questions that Eric has put together for each of the volumes, not just about the book, but about sort of the experiences of the characters and how the books impact the reader. So we have high hopes that these will be favorites with libraries and schools.
And I have to tell you that I had the pleasure of attending a book club reading of Phantom of the Opera, our specific edition of it, and people loved those discussion questions. They went through every single one of those. They talked about them, and it really invigorated a lot of interesting thought and conversation. So those are really, really useful.
And just as a part disclaimer, part advertisement, I guess, the notes in these books, this is not like any of my, quote, annotated books. There aren't clouds of notes. There are notes that we're hopeful are just sufficient to help the reader deal with words that are unfamiliar or concepts that might be unfamiliar because of their history. Some of these books are pretty old. Castle of Otranto is it's over 200 years old. Vatek is 190 years old, something like that. So, those are ancient history.
So I'm curious, since Lisa mentioned this is a long time project for her and that she had some titles already identified, and Eric and Les stepped in and are you working with the original list? Are you adding things to the list? What I'm really trying to get at is, what's your process for identifying and then selecting what's going to be part of the series?
Random. Hit or miss. These are, Eric and Lisa can speak for themselves, but these are personal favorites of ours. These are books that, we like, we want to read. We want other people to go, ooh, those are great books. That's an important element in selecting them. This is not, as I said, we're not aiming to make this inclusive of every classic, because some of them are already available. But my hope is that eventually this will be a shelf of 30, 40, 50 titles. We should live that long, Eric. And form the core of a really solid library of horror classics. We're always open to suggestions. Lisa has come up with a number of titles. We have many more on the list, but we haven't sort of selected them yet. But we'd certainly be open to hearing from readers and librarians of suggested titles that would be great to include. We don't know them all.
I'd like to jump in and just also add in, it's a very fluid process, of course. We're already in production for books that are 2 years out. And I know there are titles that Les and Lisa and I were probably very excited about including in the series at the beginning of this process, that maybe now it's dimmed just as time kind of, it changes what you value. And we just have a running list where we add different titles in there that we think, actually this title would fit a little bit better in this current environment, or this just happens to be one that I happen to personally be very excited about. 6 months down the road, even that title may change. Again, that has more to do with the list that we're absorbing all these ideas. It's kind of a cloud-based process, depending on the inputs that we receive from a lot of different individuals that are part of this. That kind of helps to mold our outputs.
And
It
I
sounds
know
so
with-
organized.
Yeah.
Or we just close our eyes and pick a number out of a hat, or that.
with something like Phantasmagoriana, which was always one I wanted to do right from the beginning, because I think it is a somewhat neglected classic. Everyone knows about those ghost stories that were told in the Via Diodati. No one has read them, and they're really marvelous. Les and I used one in our book Ghost Stories. But with something like that, we actually did not include that in our initial offering because we weren't sure if we wanted to do story collections or anthologies right off the bat. So we started with just novels. And at some point we realized, no, we really need to do some short stories, and something like M.R. James. James never wrote a novel, but doing ghost stories in an antiquary is a must, I think, if you're doing an imprint of classics of the genre. And so that was, I think at that point, somewhere around in that process is when we said, well then, yes, we can do Phantasmagoriana.
And at some point, we've even talked about we may do an anthology of our own, just because some people didn't put out enough quality material to make a whole collection that's worth reproducing. But if we pick out some stories, who knows? It's partly a question of energy too. This is. I mean, Eric makes the hard parts of this look easy, but what are we doing? 4 books a year now, basically.
Yeah, it's scheduled on a quarterly basis, every 3-month release.
And they do take some work, and all of us have other things on our plate. This should be first, of course, but
Of course.
it isn't always. And by the way, I mean, we should point out that basically everybody involved here is I would describe them as semi-volunteer. Nobody here is doing this for the big bucks. The profits from the books go to the Horror Writers Association, which is itself a 501c3 educational organization, and plowed back into our other educational efforts. We hope this actually is a profit maker for HWA, but it's not going to be a huge profit maker. This is really, as I said, mainly about sort of educating the public and lifting the genre by reminding people that there were these classics, and that if they like this sort of thing, maybe they should read some contemporary books that are similar or that launched from the base of these books.
That's going to be, just speaking from a purely librarian and reader's advisory standpoint, horror can be a tough sell because people have these ideas set about what a horror novel is, based a lot on what they've seen in movies or other things. And a lot of times, if you can convince someone, well, try this, based on what they've told you talk to them and find out what kinds of things they might be interested in. And then, because there are horror titles that will fit any taste of reader. And one of the challenges, and one of the reasons that I know Becky is so diligent in promoting Librarians Day and other readers advisory pursuits regarding horror, is there's a ton of horror out there. There is something that will fit any taste, anything that somebody wants. It's just connecting somebody with that book. And these are excellent for that purpose, because some of these books, this could be a little bit of a stretch, but they're kind of like the cozy mysteries of horror, where they're a little bit older. The language is going to be more of the period.
Liquidated.
Yeah. But, you know, a lot of readers have, they don't want to read things with expletives, or they don't want to read things that are overly gory. They don't want to read things that are, you know, they have restrictions on what they prefer. And it's not, I think, as well known, but horror writers write things that fit into those for those people just fine. And all of these books fit that perfectly. You can tell somebody, you know, try this. And then you guys have provided excellent pointers to other things that if they come back and say they love this, well, here, you know, we can point them in other directions to either more contemporary writers or other people, you know, in between. And that's one of the important things about, kind of, because so many librarians are like, well, I don't like horror, so I can't help somebody who wants to know about horror. Well, you guys have laid it out in these books. I mean, it's real easy to find other things for readers to read.
One of the other things that I think is worth mentioning about these books is that we're not editing or censoring the texts here. And I think that's important. Some of these books are not going to be wholly comfortable for readers because they reflect attitudes from a different time. For example, we're very proud to be producing the book Of One Blood, which was written in 1902 by the woman who was at that time the editor of the Colored American magazine. And it is very much a book about white people interacting with Black people. And it's a mixture of supernatural, horror, lost race stories, and all that. It all sort of mixed together. But it also is pretty honest about the racial attitudes that's largely set in America, or at least the part that isn't in Africa is set in America, and sort of the American attitudes about race at the time. And it's not necessarily going to be comfortable for everybody to read, because it wasn't a particularly great time to be a Black person in America. Not that it is today either, but we think it's important to present these books as they are, as accurate mirrors of their times.
Well, but that's true. That's true of history. I mean, reading history shouldn't be comfortable. If we're progressing, if we're advancing, if we're taking steps forward, it's going to be uncomfortable to look back and see how things were 50, 100, 200 years ago. And it should be that way. History should make you uncomfortable. If you're reading something that just feels fine, you're not reading history, you're reading propaganda.
Or you haven't matured. You're stuck in the 19th century yourself, which is always a possibility. So it's, no, we can look at somebody, well, we don't want to turn this into a discussion of Lovecraft, who we may get into at some point in this series, but you know, there's an example of somebody who liked the 19th and 18th centuries, and deliberately, he wanted very much to live in that time. He was stuck in the 20th.
But his work has also been the jumping off point for some incredible contemporary reimaginings. Yes. I mean,
absolutely.
You look at Victor Laval, or and now I can't remember her name. There's a woman who's written 2 books and I'm hoping there's going to be another one. Rosanna Emrys. taking his stuff and turning it on its head. Matt Ruff's Lovecraft Country. I mean, all of these things where Lovecraft would not be happy with what they're doing with his work, but it's fascinating and engaging and amazing. So, I mean, a really interesting question might be, who's going to read this series of books, and what are they going to do with it? What is somebody, I mean, we know that it's already influenced generations of horror writers before, but just imagine that there's some 12 to 17-year-old kid who reads one of these books and decides, well, not only I can do this, but I can put a spin on this.
Bless them.
That's a great motivating factor. That's all. That's what we're going for, is just to get, somebody to pick up the book and to read it and to be inspired to forward it, do their own take on it, talk about it, make it theirs, promote it with modern contemporary ideals. Just keep it going.
I think that's exactly the audience that we're hoping for. These books are not junior editions. They are not in any way simplified or dumbed down for readers that we think, to appeal to readers who we don't think can handle the real thing. These are the real thing. But they are all suitable for that audience. There's nothing in this series so far that a 12-year-old couldn't read and get a great deal out of it. They'll get more out of it, obviously, the older they are, but this is certainly appropriate for, what do we call that, young adult, or is that now middle school? Or
Oh no, middle school's a whole nother thing now.
Okay. I don't want to use the incorrect terminology here. So, and interesting, the group that you've got here, I'm the weak link in this group. Lisa and Eric are both fiction writers, strong fiction writers, as well as devoted nonfiction writers. I don't really have any talent as a fiction writer. And so, but we all bring to this series our love of serious investigation and as well as an appreciation for great fiction.
So, Eric, you said that you guys have books planned out for the next 2 years?
Yes. Yeah, about 2.5 years.
And they're being released quarter. So is it 4 books a quarter or 4 books a year?
4 books a year. So it's
Okay.
on a quarterly basis.
Okay. So you already know, and you've mentioned, and I'll say right up front that when I saw the listings, I think it was on the Poison Pen catalog, your collection of Doyle supernatural stories, I'm already chomping at the bit for that one. And now Lisa's mentioned Phantasmagoriana, which
that'll be next year. That's not going to be.
and
That'll be
that
2022 probably.
Yeah, 2022.
I think you guys are going to have a hit with that, just because of the history of that book and the fact that it hasn't been readily available. And the book that inspired Mary Shelley, yeah, who doesn't want to read that?
Yeah.
But so guys know what's coming up for the next bit.
Yeah, the ones that are done, and sort of just, when I say done, means we're done with them. It doesn't mean they're in print yet or anything.
Oh no.
So we have The Parasite and Other Tales of Terror, which, by the way, has an introduction by Daniel Stashower. Dan is one of the world's leading biographers of Arthur Conan Doyle. We have The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, introduction by Nick Pizzolatto, the showrunner for True Detective, who created the season with the wonderful Lovecraftian elements. Of One Blood by Pauline Hopkins, introduced by Nisi Shawl, and Ghost Stories of an Antiquarian, with an introduction by I've forgotten. David Morrell, the wonderful thriller, etc. writer, a great writer, no genre.
The master author.
And I think those are the next 4. after House on the Borderlands, which isn't out yet, but that's the fourth title that'll be out shortly.
So what's at the top of your list as far as books that you would like to make sure that probably won't see the light of day until 2023 or 2024, but is there a favorite right now? And realizing you've already said that the list changes and updates as time goes by, but is there something that you just feel needs to get out there?
Well, there's so many. I mean, The Blazing World is on my list. Lisa, what's your baby that you want to see born?
Probably Macken's The Great God Pan, which is actually a collection again.
Yes.
Because Great God Pan is fairly short, but I love that story so much. I think it would be
all the
really
stories in that collection.
critical.
All the stories in that collection are wonderful.
Exactly right. It's a great collection. We should have Macken in the series.
All right, it's consensus then. I want that one also.
And Eric, you have a baby that you're hoping?
Every time I make the suggested reading lists for these books, it just immerses me in so many titles that I think, man, I'm not familiar with this and I would love to explore it more. So yeah, that's another one that's just such a fluid process. The Monk by Matthew Gregory Lewis is a good one, and that is from the 1700s. I mean, talk about classics that are still being talked about today, and that is a dark, I mean, that would probably be the darkest title that we would have in the series.
One of the things that we've been talking about, but we haven't come to grips with yet, is the possibility of actually licensing some titles. There are some, let's see, James is 1910. Is that the date? I've forgotten the date of that book. I think that's right. So we're starting to creep up to the public domain date. The public domain date, this is now 1924. Shortly to be 1925 will be the cutoff date. So are there some great books from the early 1930s? Yes, there are. And, we'll see. We haven't really sort of dealt with that yet, but we've talked about a couple of titles. So I don't want to name any names yet, but there are certainly some books that are not public domain that we might consider trying to arrange to be in the series.
I think it might also be interesting at some point to explore the possibility of nonfiction books being reprinted in the series. There are a couple of those that could be great fun to do. Lovecraft's Montague Summers would be great. Lovecraft's supernatural horror and fiction would be great. Even the 1919 Book of Halloween by Ruth Edna Kelly would be fun. And I know somebody who could be really good at annotating that.
Yeah, lots and lots of titles. So I'm thinking The Werewolf of Paris by Guy Endore, 1933, clearly a licensed book and so on. So there's some great titles that have, it's hard to think of 1933 as a long time ago, but we have to say to ourselves, that's now almost 90 years old, that book. When we're dealing with a publishing world in which novels set in the 50s, the 1950s, are regarded as historical mysteries. So that's, some of us are getting older. So the 1930s, that's kind of like the Dark Ages, yeah.
How are you guys selecting the writers who are introducing these novels? I mean, Nisi Shaw writing the introduction to the book that now just escaped me.
Of One Blood.
I mean, that's inspired. How are you guys managing with so many great authors to and I would imagine people just want to be involved in this
for the money.
The gold-plated yachts.
Right. Well, I mean, I think the short answer is Lisa knows everybody. from her long tenure in the leadership of the horror writers. And so it's been easy to, and so we basically go to friends, and friends who we think either we know love this book in particular, or the affiliation is obvious between this person's work and the book itself, and so on. None of the introducers are doing this for anything other than the love of Horror Writers Association and of the genre generally. And, you know, this is not, I don't want to overplay the introductions. I mean, we're delighted to have them. They're more like sort of personal responses to these books. These are not scholarly introductions. That's what Eric does. These are really sort of almost like, you know, why I love this book kind of short essays. And there's been some really fine ones. We left off Chelsea Quinn Yarborough.
I was just
a
going to
lovely
mention
one.
hers, because hers for It's the Beetle,
Yes.
and her suggestion to nibble at the book rather than as she put it, wolf it down in a lupine gulp, I thought was such a great way to approach it. And it's a great suggestion from someone who knows what she's talking about, that, you know, if you stretch this out, it's creepier.
Well, and Ramsey Campbell, who you haven't read his work yet, Ramsey Campbell, who has made his career writing about the weird, you know, I mean, this is House on the Borderlands is like the Bible to him. It's, you know, it's just sort of the bedrock of his own work, as it was to Lovecraft. And so some of these are obvious. Some of them are less obvious. David Morrell happens to be a good friend of many of us and loves Victorian writing, and a great admirer of M.R. James, and was eager to do this.
Yeah, and I'd like to add on, so Morrell was an excellent choice because his own stories incorporate ghosts. A lot of his work incorporates spirituality, ghosts, these very tangential elements. And in addition, simultaneously to his roots as becoming an author, he was an English literature instructor. So he's very widely familiar with the classics. So not only is he already knows the foundations, he knows how to speak to these works, he's written towards them with similar concepts. So it's just a lot of these choices, they align with their own career paths with these subject volumes.
And it's a little known fact that Rambo was based on a character created by M.R. James. So
In fact, I think that's what the R stands for. And I was going to note that occasionally the people we get to do the introductions are happy accidents. I don't think any of us immediately went to Joe R. Lansdale to do the introduction to Vathek. That was one of those things where we were talking to him about something and he said, "Oh, I'd like to do Vathek." And it was like, really? Vathek seems so diametrically opposed to Joe's usual body of work that we were kind of flabbergasted and thoroughly delighted that he wanted to do that one.
The King in Yellow is another good example. It was just fortuity. Nick Bitzlato just happens to be a friend, and he loved the idea of doing something for The King in Yellow because he loves the book. It was inspirational to him. So.
And I really, really wanted him to do that introduction, though, because that first season of True Detective is not just great. It actually introduced a lot of people to The King in Yellow. I mean, I can tell you that as a bookseller, and I'm sure, Daryl, you had this experience as a librarian, that you could not keep that thing in stock when that show was airing.
And I should say in an example that maybe we'll repeat at some point, with the Arthur Conan Doyle collection, Dan, who is a dear friend of mine, I basically went to Dan and said, "Look, here's a list of 15, 20 stories. Pick out which ones you'd like to see included in the collection." So not only did he get to write the introduction, we knew we were going to do the Parasite, but Doyle wrote a number of stories in this genre, and Dan got to pick some of his favorites. So we got a little extra inducement there in that selection. But again, we're always open to ideas for introducers, and maybe the result of this infomercial will be some of our other writer friends coming forward saying, let me in. I really want to write an introduction for you guys. That would be great.
And I was going to mention also, in response to something Daryl had said, there are people who actually have turned us down. So if your favorite author is not included in this series, it may be that we asked them and they just, for whatever reason, were not
And
available.
you should probably write to them and tell them shame on you for turning down. By the way, I think we have already lined up an introducer for Phantasmagoriana, that being Lisa, who is a real expert on that book. So
that was the one I said, I want that one. So yeah, the book has such a fascinating history, and I've studied that history in depth, and I've written articles about it and everything else, that was one I really wanted.
An inspired choice, to say the least.
So from the point of view of the librarian, Daryl, if there are titles that you really think we need to include, do speak up. Tell us.
Well, you know, we
Doesn't have to be this many.
outside of the current year, which is a horror story in and of itself, that had someone written it, no one would believe. You know, when we're out, I mean, Margaret is so great, and we get to see her, you know, library professionals across the country get to see her a couple of times a year if we're lucky. She's always available. So yeah, it's easy that if there's an idea, if there's a title, if there's something, we definitely know who to talk to about that. And I definitely recommend that if somebody has an idea, you know who to suggest it to.
Yes, indeed. The as to the current situation, I mean, I point people at a book that is it's too recent. I don't think we can license it, but a book called Earth Abides by George Stewart, that is really one of the first books about a pandemic and sort of the consequences to the society, and came out in the 1950s. But yes, I can't think of any classics from the 19th century about this. I mean, there's certainly a lot of sort of end of the world books. Well, actually, Mary Shelley's The Last Man is one of those. And that's something, by the way, that's a book that we have on our We're Thinking About It list.
Yeah, on our radar.
There's that. And then, of course, I mean, everybody's realized that we're living the Mask of the Red Death. So...
Yes, but we're probably not going to do a collection of Poe. There's too many. Yeah. Too many. And I happen to know that Morton is publishing a massive annotated edition of Poe shortly, in the next 12 months, I think. Well, I think this is probably a good point to break this off, and thank everybody for participating in this conversation. We hope that, I mean, there is, I don't think we have an official Horror Writers Association page for this series, but Sourcebooks does, and Eric does. And we will certainly share those links with you so you can see the gorgeous covers. By the way, the covers are the creation of Sourcebooks, and we just couldn't be more pleased with them. They've just been beautiful, beautiful works of art, mostly original, as opposed to just sort of images that somebody stole from somewhere else. So, as I said, thank you all. I'm not sure why I'm the one thanking everybody, but thank you all. And
thank you in return.
This was a lot of fun.
Yes.
And now we need to get back to work on the next book in the series.